The inheritance, when the solicitor first mentioned it, felt less like a windfall and more like a logistical headache. Blackwood Manor. Even the name sounded like a bad Gothic novel. I, Arthur, a man who found solace in blueprints and the predictable stresses of structural integrity, had little patience for ancestral drama. My great-aunt's passing, a distant and reclusive relative I'd met precisely once at a funeral when I was 7, had bequeathed me a sprawling, ancient estate in a place called Oakhaven, a town so far off the grid it barely registered on my GPS until the last 50 miles. The drive itself was a descent into quiet. The highway bled into state routes, which then thinned to cracked asphalt ribbons winding through forests that grew progressively denser, darker. The air, crisp and biting back in the city, here took on a damp, earthy scent, heavy with pine and something else. Something faintly metallic, like old pennies. Oakhaven itself was less a town and more a cluster of tired-looking buildings huddled around a central, empty square. A general store with a faded awning, a post office that looked like it hadn't seen a delivery truck in a decade, and a handful of houses with sagging porches and windows that stared out like blind eyes. I pulled my sturdy sedan up to the curb, the engine's purr sounding offensively loud in the profound stillness. No children playing. No dogs barking. Just the rustle of leaves and a breeze that wasn't quite there, and a silence that pressed in, thick and palpable. A man sweeping the dusty stoop of the general store paused, his broom held mid-air. His gaze, when it met mine, was unnervingly placid, devoid of curiosity or welcome. It wasn't hostile, just vacant. Like looking into a still pond. He didn't nod, didn't smile, just watched me until I looked away, uncomfortable. A few other figures, glimpsed through windows or walking slowly down the street, shared the same peculiar detachment. It was like they were all operating on a different, much slower frequency. My skepticism, usually a sturdy shield, began to feel a little porous around the edges. Blackwood Manor sat at the end of a long, winding lane, a final, defiant gasp of neglected cobblestones. It rose from a tangle of overgrown rhododendrons and skeletal trees like a forgotten monument. Even from a distance, I could appreciate its scale. 3 stories of weathered stone, a slate roof mottled with moss, and a formidable oak door that looked capable of repelling a siege. As an architect, I had an immediate, almost professional, admiration for the sheer ambition of its construction, the intricate gables, the tall, narrow windows. It was imposing, yes, but also possessed a certain melancholic grandeur. This, I told myself, was a project. A magnificent, if dusty, project. The heavy iron gates creaked open with a groan that echoed across the vast, overgrown lawn. The house loomed, its many windows reflecting the gray afternoon sky like so many empty eyes. I unlocked the massive oak door with a key that felt ancient and heavy in my hand. It was a smell that spoke of disuse and secrets. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom of the cavernous foyer. Dust motes danced in the anemic light filtering through the grime-streaked transom window above the door. My footsteps echoed, each one a sharp intrusion into the profound stillness. There was no hum of electricity, no distant traffic, no murmur of life. Just the house, breathing its own stagnant air. I moved from room to room on the ground floor, my architects cataloging the decay, the potential, the sheer scale of the undertaking. High ceilings, intricate plasterwork, fireplaces choked with soot. Everything draped in a thick shroud of dust, like a forgotten memory. It wasn't merely the absence of sound, it felt like a presence, a weight on my eardrums, pressing in, listening. Then I found it. Tucked away behind a collapsed pantry and a service stairwell, a corridor I hadn't anticipated. The walls were unadorned, rough-hewn stone, and along one side, at regular intervals, stood heavy, bolted wooden doors, each with a small, grimy viewport. The windows along the opposite wall were thick with grime, but I could make out rusted iron bars set into the stone. A peculiar, almost industrial smell permeated this section, a mix of damp earth and something else. Something faintly chemical, like old disinfectant in fear. My logical mind, the one that built bridges and designed efficient spaces, struggled to contextualize it. This wasn't a servant's wing. It wasn't a cellar. It felt deliberate. The absolute stillness here was different, too. My fingers brushed against a deep gouge in the wood near the handle, too low to be casual damage, almost like a desperate scraping. This was no ordinary part of an ancestral home. This was an old death row corridor marked for closure. It wasn't a place designed for living, or even for storage. It was designed for containment. The house, I realized, was not merely old. It was different. I remember the solicitor's face, a placid mask of professional sympathy, as he handed over the heavy iron key. Blackwood Manor. A headache, I'd called it. Now, standing inside its echoing maw, the term felt laughably inadequate. It was a migraine, a persistent thrum of unease that settled deep behind my eyes. I'd spent the first few days simply trying to orient myself, mapping the labyrinthine corridors in my mind, a futile exercise given the house's apparent disinterest in conventional logic. Rooms seemed to appear where they shouldn't, hallways twisted unexpectedly. Today, I was determined to tackle the West Wing, a section the estate agent had vaguely referred to as structurally unsound, code for don't touch it without a tetanus shot and a team of exorcists. My architect's curiosity, however, trumped any creeping dread. I needed to understand the bones of this place. Armed with a powerful LED torch and a sketchpad, I pushed open a door that groaned like a dying beast. The air beyond was different. My breath plumed. The flashlight beam cut through an almost absolute blackness, revealing a long, narrow passageway. It wasn't like the grand, decaying halls I'd seen so far. This was utilitarian, severe. The walls were rough-hewn stone, patched haphazardly in places with crumbling mortar. A low ceiling pressed down, making the space feel claustrophobic. As I moved deeper, the beam picked out details that made my professional eye twitch. Recessed niches, too narrow for anything but a standing figure, lined one side. On the other, heavy, tarnished metal rings were set into the stone at irregular intervals, some still dangling fragments of rusted chains. This wasn't a manor house corridor. The words, stark and unsettling, didn't make sense. Death row? In an ancestral home? I ran a gloved hand over the inscription, feeling the rough edges of the carving. It was real. This house held more secrets than I could have imagined. I continued slowly, my boots crunching on unseen debris. My torch beam swept across the ceiling, then down the far end of the corridor. That's when it happened. The next, I was halfway back down the corridor, leaning against a cold stone wall, my heart hammering against my ribs. My torch lay on the floor a few feet away, its beam pointing uselessly at the ceiling. How had I moved? I hadn't turned around. I hadn't walked. One moment I was facing the inscription, the next I was several yards away, facing the way I'd come. My mind scrambled, trying to reconstruct the last few seconds. Had I tripped? Had I simply zoned out, lost in thought, and instinctively retreated? No, that wasn't right. I distinctly remembered standing there, by the inscription, a moment ago. The intervening steps, the pivot, the sudden shift in my position, they were simply gone. A blank. A wave of dizziness washed over me, and I pressed the heel of my hand against my forehead. Too much stress, Arthur. Too little sleep. This ancient mausoleum was getting to me. My logical brain, the one that designed steel frameworks and calculated load-bearing capacities, immediately sought a rational explanation. A microsleep, perhaps? Yes, that had to be it. My eyes flickered to the spot where I remembered standing. No, I was definitely here now. I bent down, retrieved the torch, and shone it back towards the inscription. It was still there, mocking my attempt at composure. As the light played over the rough stone, another image flickered into my mind, sharp and instantaneous, like a faulty projector bulb. I saw a man. Not me. A different man, gaunt and terrified, his back pressed against the same stone niche I had just examined. His eyes, wide with a despair that felt utterly visceral, were fixed on something just beyond my current field of vision. And then, a sound. A low, guttural growl that seemed to emanate from the very stones, a sound that promised an end, not of life, but of self. The air around him shimmered, distorting, as if his very essence was being drawn out, like smoke from a dying fire. My palms were sweating, my breath catching in my throat. I squeezed my eyes shut, then opened them again, trying to shake the phantom image. What was that? A hallucination? A trick of the light, fueled by my overactive imagination and the creepy setting? I told myself it was fatigue. I was an architect, a man of logic and reason, not a ghost hunter. This house was old, yes, and unsettling, but it was just a collection of bricks and mortar, timber and plaster. Yet, the image of that man, his profound despair, felt so real. It wasn't just a sight, it was an emotion, a memory that had been thrust upon me, a memory that didn't belong to Arthur. My earlier rationalization about the missing steps felt flimsy now, a hastily constructed scaffold threatening to collapse. I wasn't just exploring a house, I was walking through layers of forgotten suffering, and some of it, it seemed, was reaching back. Blackwood Manor. The solicitor's words, echoing in my memory, had promised a headache. It was a migraine, a persistent thrum of unease that settled deep behind my eyes, pushing against the thin barrier of my skepticism. I'd spent a sleepless night, the house creaking and sighing around me like a restless leviathan. Every shadow seemed to stretch, to lean, and the air, thick with the scent of aged dust and something else, something vaguely metallic, pressed in on me. I wasn't one for ghost stories, not really. My mind was built on blueprints and logical constructs. But the manor. It was defying all my constructs. So, I decided, if it wanted to play games, I'd play back. My investigation began, not with a bang, but with a methodical, almost desperate, search for answers. I started in the library, a vast space lined with more books than any single person could read in a lifetime, their spines cracked and faded, exuding the dry, papery scent of forgotten knowledge. I was looking for anything, old ledgers, correspondence, journals, anything that might explain the house's unsettling atmosphere, or perhaps, its lineage. I spent hours, systematically pulling volumes, checking behind them for hidden compartments, running my fingers along the rough-hewn paneling. The silence was profound, broken only by the rustle of paper and the occasional, inexplicable groan from the floorboards above me, as if the house itself were shifting its weight. I found nothing. No, that's not quite right. I found less than nothing. I'd specifically placed a stack of brittle, yellowed newspapers on a small side table, intending to return to them. When I turned back, half an hour later, they were gone. Not just moved, but vanished. I scoured the table, the floor, the nearby shelves. Nothing. I told myself it was fatigue, a trick of the light, but the memory of setting them down, the faint thump they made, was too vivid. Later that afternoon, a delivery driver arrived, navigating his dusty van up the long, winding drive. He brought a box of basic supplies I'd ordered from the nearest town. He was a wiry man, with eyes that seemed a little too wide and a smile that didn't quite reach them. "Settling in, are we, Arthur?" he asked, his voice low, almost a murmur, as he placed the box on the porch. He didn't meet my gaze directly. "Trying to," I replied, forcing a lightness I didn't feel. "It's a big place." He nodded slowly, his eyes scanning the manor's imposing facade. "She remembers, you know," he said, not to me, but to the house itself. "Every step, every breath. She holds it all." And sometimes, he paused, finally glancing at me, a flicker of something unreadable in his gaze. "Sometimes, she asks for it back." He offered no further explanation. Just a solemn nod, then turned and drove off, leaving me standing alone on the porch, the delivery box at my feet. She asks for it back. What, exactly, did she ask for? The encounter, coupled with the vanishing newspapers, spurred me on. I pushed deeper into the manor's less used wings. I found a pantry that, just yesterday, I could have sworn was a small antechamber. The layout felt fluid, subtly shifting, like a dream you can't quite grasp upon waking. I started drawing a rudimentary map, only to find my pencil lines blurring, the corners refusing to connect, the dimensions refusing to make sense. A loose floorboard, easily missed. Beneath it, nestled in the dust and splintered wood, was a small, leather-bound journal. No name on the front, no title, just a sense of age and desperation clinging to it. I carried it to the relative light of the main hall, settling onto a dusty armchair. The journal's first entries were mundane, a record of daily life, but as I turned the pages, the handwriting grew spidier, the words more erratic. The walls. They hum. A low, persistent thrum. It's not the wind. It's something else. Fading. Small things at first. A name. A face. Now, larger chunks. What did I have for breakfast? Where did I put the key? It feels like a husk. And then, a drawing. A crude, unsettling sketch of the manor, but with tendrils, like roots or veins, reaching out from its foundation, coiling around a stick figure. Beneath it, scrawled in a shaky hand, "She feeds. She always feeds. And the town. They are her echoes." My breath hitched. The driver's words. The disappearing newspapers. The shifting rooms. This house wasn't just old, it was alive. And it was hungry. A faint, metallic scent, like old blood and rust, drifted to me from a corridor I hadn't noticed before, tucked away behind a tapestry depicting a hunting scene. The light from the main hall barely penetrated its depths. Driven by a morbid curiosity, I walked forward, the journal clutched in my hand. The corridor stretched on, longer than seemed possible within the manor's footprint, its walls stark, unadorned stone, unlike the ornate wallpaper or wood paneling elsewhere. Small, heavy doors, each with a narrow slit at eye level, punctuated one side. No handles, just bolts, rusted and thick. This wasn't a servant's passage, or a storage area. This was a place of confinement. There, scrawled faintly on the rough stone wall at the very end, almost invisible in the gloom, was a faded, weathered sign. What in God's name was this place? What had this house been? The journal's words, "She feeds." This wasn't just a headache. This was a gaping, hungry maw, and I was standing right inside it, the taste of rust and forgotten suffering thick in my mouth. The air in the study felt thick, pressing in, as if the very walls were exhaling. This wasn't just a headache, I'd thought. This was a maw. And I was inside. I tried to shake off the profound dread, to rationalize. My rational mind, the one that designed blueprints and calculated structural loads, demanded an explanation. But the explanation, if it existed, was slipping away. I needed coffee. Or maybe just a moment of quiet, a space where the house's oppressive silence didn't feel like a predatory hush. I turned to leave the study, my hand reaching for the doorknob. Had I left the window open earlier? I couldn't recall. A small thing, easily forgotten, but it nagged at me. I was meticulous, almost obsessively so. Such a lapse felt alien. Later, in the cavernous kitchen, the silence was even deeper, broken only by the drip of the faucet, a rhythm that seemed to mock my unease. I poured water into the kettle, my hand trembling slightly. What was the name of that firm I'd worked with on the City Hall project? The one with the particularly fussy senior partner? It was right there, on the tip of my tongue. A familiar name, a face I could almost picture. But the name wouldn't materialize. Just a blank, a smooth, featureless wall where a memory should have been. I frowned, annoyed. Too much stress, I told myself. Too much old house. As the kettle began to whistle, a different sound emerged, faint but distinct, from somewhere deep within the house. A low, guttural murmur. It wasn't the wind, nor the groan of old timber. It was too regular, too resonant. I froze, kettle forgotten. The murmur faded, leaving behind a profound quiet that felt heavier than before. My skin prickled. I found myself pacing the ground floor, drawn by an inexplicable urge to check every room, as if something might have shifted in my absence. The grand hall, with its sweeping staircase, felt different. The light filtering through the stained glass window at the landing seemed dimmer, the colors more muted, bleeding into each other like old bruises. I remembered a specific vibrant crimson, a detail I'd admired on my first walkthrough. Now, it was a dull rust. Had it always been so? I couldn't be sure. The uncertainty was a corrosive acid, eating at the edges of my perception. I walked past a series of closed doors, each one an invitation to another forgotten chamber. One door, in particular, caught my attention. It was plain, unadorned, set into a wall I didn't remember. I was certain it hadn't been there yesterday, or had it. My memory, once a steel trap, was now a sieve. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through the door. I pushed the door open. A shiver traced its way down my spine. This wasn't part of the manor I knew. This felt institutional. Inhuman. Death row? Here? In Blackwood Manor? My mind reeled, trying to reconcile this brutal, anachronistic space with the ancestral home I'd inherited. This wasn't a historical detail I'd overlooked, this was an impossibility. I stumbled back, clutching my temples. When the pain subsided, a new wave of confusion washed over me. What was I doing here? Why was I in this house? My name. Arthur. Yes, Arthur. But what was my profession? An architect. I built things. Structures, but what structures? The City Hall project, the fussy partner. The faces of my colleagues, their names, they were dissolving, like photographs left out in the rain. I stared at my hands, calloused from years of drafting and site visits. Were these my hands? They felt alien, disconnected. Who was I? It wasn't language, not really, but a cacophony of lost voices, a chorus of forgotten identities. I slammed the door shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the grand hall. I leaned against it, gasping, my heart hammering against my ribs. My memories, my identity, they were fraying, unraveling like an old tapestry. The house wasn't just old, it was a predator, and I, Arthur, was its prey. But who was Arthur, now? My fingers still tingled from the touch of the brittle paper, the frantic scrawl of the former owner's last entry. It wasn't just a house, it was a maw, an ancient, patient hunger. I felt it now, a cold prickle beneath my skin, an awareness that wasn't quite my own. A low thrum began to vibrate through the floorboards, a resonance that felt less like a sound and more like a presence. It pulsed, a slow, deliberate heartbeat, drawing me away from the study, away from the damning evidence on the desk. The thrumming intensified, a deep hum that seemed to resonate within my very bones, pulling me down, further into the manor's depths. I didn't consciously decide to move, my feet simply obeyed, carrying me through the shadowed halls, past portraits whose eyes seemed to follow my every step, their painted smiles stretching just a fraction too wide. The grand, ornate stairs eventually gave way to rough-hewn stone steps, slick with condensation. The deeper I went, the more the manor peeled back its layers, revealing something raw and primal beneath its elegant facade. The thrumming was louder here, almost a growl, a palpable force pushing against my chest. My breath plumed in the frigid air, each exhalation a cloud of fear. Then, a flicker of light ahead. Not the steady glow of a bulb, but a wavering, sickly yellow, like a dying candle. It beckoned, a moth to a flame, and I, a moth drawn to its own immolation, followed. This was it. The walls were lined with heavy, rusted iron doors, each one bearing a small, grimy viewport. As my eyes adjusted to the dimness, I noticed a figure standing at the far end of the corridor, silhouetted against the sickly light. It was the general store owner. He was facing one of the iron doors, his back to me, his shoulders hunched. He wasn't moving, just standing there, utterly still. It seemed to emanate not from him, but from the corridor itself, from the very stones. The sound seemed to be swallowed by the corridor, absorbed by the damp walls. The store owner didn't turn. He didn't even twitch. A guttural rumble that spoke of hunger, of assimilation, of becoming. Then, slowly, deliberately, the store owner turned his head. Only his head. His body remained facing the iron door. His eyes, when they met mine, were not the watery blue I remembered. The lines on his face were gone, smoothed away, replaced by an unnerving blankness. It was his face, yes, but it wasn't him. It was a mask, a puppet. A slow, deliberate smile stretched across his lips, far too wide, far too serene. It wasn't his smile. It was the house's smile. And then, he spoke, his voice a low, resonant drone that was an echo of the thrumming I'd felt earlier, layered with the store owner's familiar inflections, yet utterly alien. "You came back, Arthur," he said, the words seeming to ripple through the very air, vibrating in my chest. "She knew you would." He shouldn't have known my name. I'd never introduced myself. The store owner I'd met barely remembered my order for canned peaches. This was different. This was beyond memory, beyond mere influence. This was a complete overwrite. His identity, his essence, it was gone. Replaced. She always feeds. This wasn't a haunting. This was a parasitic entity, a consciousness that devoured, consumed, and replaced. It wasn't just influencing them, it was wearing them. And now it was looking at me, through the empty eyes of a man I barely knew, with a hunger that was ancient and insatiable. The walls of my own mind, the carefully constructed barriers of skepticism and logic, began to crumble. A flood of alien thoughts, fragmented images that weren't mine, rushed in. My own memories flickered, threatened, like candles in a gale. Who was I? Arthur, the architect? My hands flew to my head, clawing at my temples as if to physically hold my thoughts in place, to keep myself from unraveling. The air grew impossibly heavy, pressing down, stifling. I wasn't just in the house was in me. And it was tasting. It was feeding. A jolt of pure terror had indeed shot through me, cold and sharp, but it quickly transmuted into a frantic, burning resolve. This wasn't some spectral resident to be ignored or appeased, it was a hungry, insidious thing, and I was on its menu. The realization that my own mind was already being gnawed at, that my memories were like loose threads unraveling, ignited a desperate urgency. I couldn't afford to lose myself entirely, to become another blank canvas for Blackwood Manor's dark designs. I had to fight back, and the first step was to understand how. I started in the manor's sprawling, dust-choked library. The air hung thick with the scent of decaying paper and something else, something cloying and ancient, like dried blood and forgotten dreams. My fingers, surprisingly steady despite the tremor in my gut, ran over spines of leather-bound tomes, their titles often illegible under layers of grime. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, a grimoire, a hidden diary, an architectural plan with a secret chamber marked in red ink, but I knew I'd recognize it when I saw it. Or, at least, I hoped I would. I'd catch myself staring blankly at a wall, the thought I'd just had dissolving like smoke. Stay focused, Arthur. Hours bled into one another. I pulled down heavy books, their pages brittle and yellowed, filled with obscure local histories, botanical studies of Oakhaven's unique flora, and even some strange, rambling sermons from a long-dead preacher. Most of it was useless, but I devoured it all, my mind racing, trying to find a pattern, a repeated symbol, any hint of a weakness. Inside, the handwriting was spidery and inconsistent, almost as if penned by several different hands, or perhaps one hand over a very long, deteriorating period. It binds itself to forgotten places, places of finality and regret. There, its power is absolute, its roots deepest. A severing requires a ritual of undoing, where the echoes of its hunger are most profound. What was that? I'd explored most of the manor, or so I thought. This wasn't a phrase I'd ever heard, nor a place I could immediately picture. This wasn't just a house, it was a living tomb, a monument to despair. The thought that such a place could exist within Blackwood Manor, hidden from common sight, made the hairs on my arms stand on end. I retraced my steps, not to the library, but to the deepest, oldest sections of the house, areas I'd previously dismissed as merely storage or unstable ruins. I pushed through a heavy oak door, long and used, leading into a section I'd only glimpsed from the outside, a low, windowless wing that jutted out like a broken limb. Corridors stretched before me, narrow and claustrophobic, lined with peeling, gray plaster. Many doors were boarded shut, but I kept pushing, driven by the cryptic words in the ledger. The floor underfoot was rough concrete, uneven and gritty. Or perhaps, from within my own skull. A corridor, distinct from the others. Along one side, a series of heavy, rusted iron doors, each with a small, barred window set into it, were spaced at regular intervals. Above each door, a faded, stenciled number was barely visible. The air here was thick with a profound, aching sadness, a residue of countless desperate breaths. This was it. The air was so heavy I felt like I was breathing water. I shone my light on the walls, and there, scratched into the plaster beside the numbered doors, were crude symbols, circles intersected by lines, jagged crosses, and what looked like distorted human figures. They weren't graffiti, they were desperate invocations, prayers, or perhaps warnings. On the floor, near the last door, a small, lacquered wooden box lay half-buried under a pile of rubble. My hands trembled as I cleared away the debris, revealing the box fully. It was old, intricately carved with patterns that seemed to shift and writhe in the beam of my flashlight. I pried it open. Inside, nestled on a bed of dried, crumbling leaves, was a rolled parchment and a small, tarnished silver amulet. I carefully unrolled the parchment. The script was ancient, almost pictorial, but a few words, scrawled in a more modern hand at the bottom, translated part of it, the binding of the Blackwood heart. A severing of roots. The ritual demands. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum against the encroaching stillness. This wasn't just a weakness, it was a desperate, dangerous counterforce. I finally had a weapon, a direction. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum against the encroaching stillness. The house, I realized, was fighting me even now, its oppressive presence intensifying, trying to cloud my mind, to make me forget what I had. The thought itself felt like trying to grasp smoke. It slipped, it warped, it refused to coalesce into a clear, actionable idea. But I wouldn't let it. Not yet. A cold, hard kernel of determination had solidified inside me, a tiny, defiant ember against the pervasive chill of the manor. I remembered the symbols, the faded script in the old journal, the sensation of something breaking when I'd seen it. That was the key. I pushed myself up, my knees protesting, muscles screaming in phantom agony. The air in the study felt thick, pressing in on me, smelling of dust and something vaguely metallic, like old blood. Or perhaps that was just my imagination, another trick of the house. I stumbled out, down the familiar grand staircase that now seemed to stretch into an impossible chasm beneath me. Each step was an effort, a battle against an unseen current trying to pull me back, to soothe me into complacency. As I moved through the lower halls, the silence was broken by the creak of floorboards above me, the whisper of air through unseen vents, sounds that always felt like the house itself breathing. But then, other sounds began to filter in. Not from the house, but from outside. A low murmur, growing steadily, and then, shapes. The baker, his flour-dusted apron now strangely pristine. The shopkeeper, his spectacles reflecting the dim light with an unsettling blankness. A group of teenagers, usually boisterous, now stood unnaturally still, their faces devoid of expression. They formed a silent, unmoving blockade. "Arthur," the baker said, his voice flat, devoid of its usual warmth. "You should rest. There's nothing to be done." The shopkeeper stepped forward, his hand reaching out, not to grab me, but to simply block my path, his eyes like polished stones. "You're confused. This isn't a good path." They didn't threaten, didn't raise their voices. Their resistance was far more insidious, a wall of passive, unwavering obstruction. It was the house speaking through them, using their familiar forms to instill doubt, to sap my will. Why was I going this way? What was I doing? The symbols, the ritual. It was all dissolving into a meaningless jumble. I pushed past the shopkeeper, who offered no resistance, yet somehow his presence felt like pushing through solid rock. His eyes followed me, empty and accusing. The others shifted, not quite moving to stop me, but subtly altering their positions to maintain the illusion of an impassable barrier. I remembered the route, or what I thought was the route. Down into the forgotten cellars, past the moldering wine racks, through a crumbling passage I'd only found by accident weeks ago. The smell of damp earth and decay intensified. The house groaned around me, a deeper, more resonant sound down here, as if its very foundations were screaming. The passageway led to a heavy, iron-bound door, long rusted shut. I'd seen it before, but never truly understood its significance. Now, a frantic certainty propelled me. I braced myself, pushing with all my might. The metal shrieked, protesting, but slowly, agonizingly, it gave way, scraping across the stone floor. The steps led down, further than I thought possible, into a space that felt utterly cut off from the world above. And then I saw it. The beam of my lantern fell upon a long, narrow corridor, carved roughly from the rock, damp with condensation. Its walls were marked with faded, ancient carvings, some too eroded to decipher, others unnervingly clear. There were names, dates, etched into the stone, and what looked like tally marks. The markings on the walls weren't just names, they were declarations, finality. The house didn't just consume, it judged. It held its inhabitants captive, then condemned them, slowly draining them of their essence. This corridor was its ultimate chamber, a place where it executed the final severing. My head swam. Memories, fleeting and fragile, danced at the edges of my vision. A woman's face, indistinct, dissolving. A child's laughter, fading like an echo. Were these my memories? Or were they the last vestiges of those who had been condemned here, clinging to the stone, to the very air? The house was showing me its trophies, its victims. Trying to overwhelm me with the sheer weight of its history, its power. What was this for? What did these things do? I forced myself to remember the pattern, the symbols, the precise arrangement. I knelt, scraping away decades of grime from the floor, revealing a faint, circular indentation. I placed the stone at its center. I crushed the herbs, their acrid scent momentarily cutting through the damp air, sprinkling them in a precise ring. And then, with a shaking hand, I uncorked the vial, letting 3 drops of my blood fall onto the stone. The moment the blood touched the stone, the corridor lurched. Not an earthquake, but something far more visceral, as if the very fabric of reality was being twisted. A sound, low and guttural, resonated from the stone, vibrating up through my knees, into my chest. It was a sound of ancient, raw fury. The walls began to weep, not water, but a thick, viscous blackness that oozed from the carved names, running down the stone faces like tears. The air grew heavy, suffocating. I felt a crushing weight on my chest, a pressure that threatened to collapse my lungs. My memories, the fragile anchors of my identity, were being torn away, not gradually now, but in great, ragged chunks. I saw flashes, my childhood home, a beloved pet, the face of a colleague, all dissolving into static, replaced by images of crumbling stone, endless corridors, and the vacant eyes of the townspeople. It felt as if 1,000 needles were being driven into my brain, each one trying to pry loose another piece of me. But even as the pain threatened to consume me, even as my mind fragmented further, a terrifying certainty bloomed. The house was reacting. It was fighting. And that meant my plan, whatever it was working. I had inflicted a wound. I clawed my way back towards the stone, towards the ritual, towards the roaring, consuming heart of Blackwood Manor. I could just turn around, couldn't I? Go back to the quiet rooms, let the gentle hum of the house soothe me. The faces of the townspeople, their eyes placid and vacant, seemed to float before me, beckoning. Join us, Arthur. Rest. But then, a jolt. A flash of a blueprint, a precise measurement, the satisfying click of a perfectly fitted joint. These weren't comforts, they were anchors. My anchors. They sliced through the house's syrupy influence, pulling me back to the urgent, desperate truth. I was Arthur. An architect. And this house, this sprawling, malevolent structure, was trying to erase me. The grand staircase, usually a testament to forgotten craftsmanship, now seemed to undulate, each step a challenge to my balance, each baluster a grotesque, leering face. The house was fighting, not with brute force, but with disorientation, with the insidious erosion of my senses. The walls began to shift, the grand, ornate wallpaper melting into patches of damp, crumbling plaster. The scent of dust and decay, usually faint, intensified, mingling with something metallic and sharp, like old blood. I found myself no longer in the familiar corridors of Blackwood Manor, but somewhere deeper, somewhere the house kept hidden. The passageway narrowed, the ceiling lowering until I had to duck my head. The ornate doors were gone, replaced by heavy, riveted steel, each one marked with an individual, fated number. A cold, damp chill seeped from the stone, and the only light came from flickering, bare bulbs strung precariously from frayed wires. The air hung heavy with a sense of utter finality. This wasn't a memory, not an illusion in the way the shifting walls were. This was a physical space, twisted and reclaimed by the house, a testament to its deepest hunger. The numbers on the steel doors seemed to hum, each representing a soul consumed, an identity extinguished. The house wasn't just consuming, it was imprisoning. It built these mental cells, these spiritual oubliettes, for every mind it devoured. And I was walking into my own. I was an architect. I reached out, my fingers scraping against the rough, cold stone of the corridor wall. It felt real. Too real. This wasn't just a mental construct, it was a physical manifestation of the house's core. And if it was physical, it had rules. It had flaws. I started to move, not blindly, but methodically. I ran my hand along the wall, feeling for inconsistencies. I measured my steps, counting the distance between each numbered door. I looked up at the ceiling, tracing the path of the wires, noting the stress points where the stone met the decaying concrete. My training, my very essence, surged to the forefront, pushing back the encroaching fog. The house wanted me to surrender to its amorphous will, but my mind craved order, structure, logic. They weren't just suggestions now, they were attacks. Memories, fleeting and fragmented, flashed before my eyes, my mother's smile, the smell of sawdust in my father's workshop, the quiet satisfaction of a completed blueprint. But each image was instantly overlaid with a distorted version, a grotesque mockery. My mother's smile became a rictus, the sawdust turned to dust of bone, the blueprint twisted into a trap. "You are nothing," the collective voice hissed, echoing from every numbered cell. "A collection of borrowed thoughts. A temporary vessel. We are eternal. We are the foundation. No." My own voice, thin and reedy at first, gained strength. "You are a parasite. A construct." This door was different. It wasn't numbered. It was seamless, almost invisible against the stone, yet it hummed with a profound, malevolent energy. This was it. The heart of the house. As I approached, the wall before me shimmered, revealing not a door, but a vast, intricate web of glowing lines, like a holographic blueprint. It was the house's consciousness, rendered visible, its entire parasitic architecture laid bare. I saw the tendrils reaching out, connecting to the numbered cells, to the rooms above, to the very town itself. I saw the nexus points, the conduits of stolen identity. The reveal, the house wasn't a single, unified entity in the way a living being was. It was a network, a monstrous, self-sustaining system. Its strength lay in its ability to integrate, to seamlessly weave stolen identities into its own fabric. It could absorb anything, but it needed to understand it, to categorize it, to integrate it into its existing, malevolent order. It couldn't tolerate true, unadulterated chaos within its own core structure. My architectural precision kicked in, sharper than ever. I needed to introduce an element it couldn't integrate, a concept that defied its parasitic logic. I looked at my own fragmented mind, the shards of Arthur that remained. They were scattered, broken, but they were mine. And in their brokenness, they held a power the house couldn't comprehend. I wouldn't try to make myself whole again, not yet. Instead, I would use my shattered identity as a weapon. I closed my eyes, focusing not on what I had lost, but on the act of losing, on the process of fragmentation itself. I pictured the house's glowing network, its intricate, self-satisfied design. And then, with a fierce, desperate surge of will, I began to rearrange the fragments of my own mind, not into a coherent whole, but into a deliberate, internal paradox. I took my memories, my skills, my emotions, and I twisted them, not into something destructive, but into something illogical, something that defied the house's internal categorization. A blueprint for a building that folded in on itself. A precise calculation that yielded infinite, contradictory results. It was a profound sacrifice, a conscious decision to embrace my own brokenness, to weaponize the very thing the house was trying to inflict upon me. A shriek, not of sound, but of pure psychic agony, ripped through the corridor. The glowing network before me spasmed violently. The house was trying to integrate my deliberate chaos, and it was choking on it. Its intricate structure, designed to absorb an order, was being overwhelmed by an unintegratable anomaly. I felt a searing pain behind my eyes, as if my brain itself was being stretched and torn. The house was fighting back, trying to crush my will, to force my fragments back into its own comprehensible order. But I held firm, pouring every last ounce of my being into maintaining the internal paradox, an architect designing the ultimate, self-destructive flaw into its enemy. As I approached, the air itself seemed to thicken, pressing in on me, not just with cold, but with an ancient, suffocating weight. The seamless surface of the door, where stone should have met stone, vibrated, a low, resonant thrum that I felt in my teeth, in the marrow of my bones. It wasn't a sound I heard with my ears, but with my entire being. I reached out, my hand trembling, and pressed my palm against the cool, smooth surface. It was like touching the skin of something vast and dormant, yet profoundly aware. A surge of energy, sharp and cold, shot up my arm, through my chest, and exploded behind my eyes. It wasn't pain, not precisely, but an overwhelming emptiness, a sudden vacuum where my thoughts should have been. Then, a tearing. The thrumming intensified, vibrating through the stone beneath me, through the very air. I closed my eyes, but the blood-red light still pulsed behind my eyelids, a relentless, internal rhythm. When I opened them again, the corridor was still there, but subtly altered. The seamless door was gone. In its place was just a section of the rough, unadorned stone wall, indistinguishable from the rest. No numbers, no hum, no faint crimson glow. Just stone. I pushed myself up, my muscles aching as if I'd been wrestling with a ghost. My head throbbed, a dull, persistent ache behind my temples. My memories felt smudged, like charcoal drawings rubbed by a careless thumb. I tried to recall the face of my mother, the layout of my old flat, the specific scent of the sea during my last holiday. The details were there, but faded, lacking the sharp edges of personal recollection. They felt like facts I'd read in a book, not experiences I'd lived. A profound, unsettling stillness had settled over Blackwood Manor. I walked through the empty halls, my footsteps echoing unnervingly loud. I made my way to the front door, the heavy oak swinging open with an ease it had never displayed before. Outside, the morning sun was blinding. Oakhaven stretched before me, bathed in a golden light that felt alien and almost painful to my eyes. I saw the caretaker himself, tending to a patch of roses, his back to me. He looked different. Less hunched, less withdrawn. As I watched, he straightened, stretching his arms towards the sky, a small, almost imperceptible smile on his lips. He looked like a man waking from a long, troubled sleep. The general store owner, usually a blur of nervous energy, was calmly sweeping the porch of his shop. The town had been released. The house's grip had loosened. But what about me? I walked, not towards the town, but down the winding driveway, towards the rusted gates. My reflection in the tarnished brass of the gate latch startled me. They were barely visible, but they were there. A subtle etching, a mark. I touched my face, the skin cool beneath my fingertips. The lines felt like they were under the skin, part of me now. The house was subdued, yes. Its pervasive hunger had been quelled, its influence over Oakhaven seemingly broken. But it hadn't been destroyed. It had merely been reabsorbed. Or perhaps, it had found a new vessel. A memory flickered, sharp and vivid, cutting through the haze, the seamless door, the tearing sensation, the overwhelming emptiness and the subsequent insertion star. The house hadn't just released its grip, it had transferred a part of itself. A fragment. A seed. I looked back at Blackwood Manor, standing silent and inert under the morning sun. It looked like any old, grand estate now, devoid of its malevolent aura. But I knew better. I felt the faint, distant thrum in my bones, a low, persistent hum that was no longer external, but internal. It was subtle, easily ignored amidst the rush of the world, but it was there. A quiet whisper in the back of my mind, a new layer to my consciousness. I was free, yes. I had survived. I had severed the house's parasitic hold on Oakhaven, but the cost had been myself. My memories were fractured, my identity irrevocably altered, and a piece of Blackwood Manor now resided within me, a silent, watchful presence. I was Arthur, yes, but I was also something more, something ancient and insidious. The house had not been defeated, it had simply found a new home. And I was its keeper now, forever marked, forever carrying its echoes within my very soul. It had only just begun.